To navigate a vertical rock face, a human calculates spatial orientation, processes immediate sensory feedback, and executes precise muscle contractions in fractions of a second. Every physical action and internal autonomic response is driven by the highly coordinated, multi-layered machine of the central nervous system. The brain is not a uniform mass of tissue. It operates on the strict principle of functional localization. Specific spatial territories within the skull map directly to highly specific neurological functions. This 3D model visualizes that central hierarchical architecture. We divide the brain into 4 major anatomical regions: the brainstem, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. Because functions are strictly localized, neurologists can use physical deficits to map an inverse pathway. By observing exactly what a patient can no longer do, clinicians can pinpoint the exact anatomical location of the tissue damage. Mastering neuroanatomy requires moving past rote memorization. It requires learning the brain's structural code to reverse engineer any neurological failure. Sitting atop the ascending and descending tracts of the spinal cord is the brainstem, consisting of the medulla, pons, and midbrain. The medulla acts as the primary survival center, driving baseline respiration, heart rate, blood pressure, and managing reflexes like swallowing and coughing. Moving superiorly is the pons. This physical bridge to the cerebellum houses facial nuclei and regulates breathing and sleep. Capping the brainstem is the midbrain, managing visual and auditory reflexes, housing cranial nerves 3 and 4, and modulating dopamine. Running diffusely through this entire brainstem corridor is the reticular formation. This network maintains conscious wakefulness, modulates pain, and sets baseline autonomic tone. A lesion localized anywhere in this base structure directly threatens cranial nerve deficits and catastrophic vital instability. Positioned immediately posterior to the pons and medulla is the cerebellum. The cerebellum does not initiate voluntary movement. Instead, it receives the motor plan and refines it. It calculates the necessary adjustments for coordination, precision, posture, and speech smoothness. Structurally, lateral hemispheres control limb coordination, the central vermis controls the trunk, and the inferior flocculonodular lobe manages vestibular balance. When the cerebellum is damaged, the resulting clinical deficit is known as ataxia. A patient with an isolated cerebellar lesion retains full muscle strength, yet when they attempt to walk, their movements are visibly staggering and uncoordinated. Without the cerebellum acting as a real-time subconscious editor for physical action, the body cannot correct its own movement errors. Moving deeper into the center of the brain, around the third ventricle, we map the diencephalon. At its core is the thalamus. These bilateral nuclei act as the brain's primary relay station, routing incoming signals and managing attention. Just inferior to the thalamus, on the floor of the third ventricle, is the hypothalamus. This region strictly regulates homeostasis, dictating body temperature, hunger, thirst, and circadian rhythm. It directs the pituitary gland, which sits below it. The pituitary is the master endocrine output, releasing hormones like ACTH, TSH, and growth hormone into the bloodstream. Positioned directly above it is the optic chiasm, the anatomical crossing point for nasal retinal visual fibers. In the posterior diencephalon sits the pineal gland, which regulates the sleep-wake cycle through the production of melatonin. Because of this tight anatomical packing, a single localized mass, like a pituitary tumor, compresses multiple structures at once. The patient will present with profound endocrine failure, autonomic dysfunction, and a specific loss of peripheral vision known as bitemporal hemianopia. Next, the limbic system wraps around the diencephalon. This circuit drives emotion, motivation, fear, and reward processing. Within the deep medial temporal area, the hippocampus forms new spatial memories, while the adjacent amygdala handles threat recognition and emotional memory. Positioned laterally to the diencephalon are the deep gray matter nuclei of the basal ganglia, the caudate, putamen, globus pallidus, and subthalamic nucleus. The basal ganglia encodes habit learning. More critically, it is responsible for initiating desired movements, smoothing motor actions, and continuously suppressing unwanted physical movement. Dysfunction in these deep nuclei results in profound movement disorders, primarily Parkinson's disease, Huntington disease, or dystonia. When the basal ganglia fails to suppress those unwanted motor signals, the physical manifestation is often a pronounced, rhythmic resting tremor. Before any conscious motor command reaches the muscles, these deep subcortical structures process the emotional intent and filter it through established motor habits. Enclosing all of these deep structures is the cerebrum. The two hemispheres communicate across a white matter bridge called the corpus callosum. The outer gray matter layer is folded into ridges called gyri and grooves called sulci. Anterior to the central sulcus is the frontal lobe, the seat of conscious thought, personality, and executive decision-making. It is highly compartmentalized. The most anterior section, the prefrontal cortex, dictates impulse control. Moving backward, the premotor cortex holds learned movement blueprints. Finally, the primary motor cortex executes the command, acting as the origin of the corticospinal tract. Usually located in the left inferior frontal gyrus is Broca's area, the specific cortical zone responsible for speech production and motor language output. Immediately posterior to the central sulcus is the parietal lobe. This region processes somatic sensation, proprioception, and spatial body mapping. Sitting on its post-central gyrus is the primary somatosensory cortex, which maps touch, pain, temperature, and pressure from the entire body. These two adjacent lobes yield drastically different clinical outcomes when damaged. A frontal lesion results in personality shifts, contralateral physical weakness, and Broca aphasia. A parietal lesion leaves muscle strength intact, but causes severe contralateral neglect and a profound loss of sensory awareness. Dropping laterally below the lateral sulcus, we find the temporal lobe. This is the cortical center for hearing, smell association, and memory. Usually situated in the left posterior superior temporal lobe is Wernicke's area, required for language comprehension and understanding spoken words. At the posterior-most pole of the brain is the occipital lobe. Tucked around the calcarine sulcus, it receives raw visual input, while surrounding association areas process complex tasks like face and object recognition. Finally, if we pull apart the temporal and frontal lobes along the lateral sulcus, we expose the insula. This hidden layer of cortex processes taste, visceral sensation, and autonomic emotional integration. Lesions in these regions frequently spare a patient's physical motor function. A temporal or occipital stroke leaves a patient entirely capable of movement, but can completely devastate their ability to comprehend language or perceive the visual world. This split-screen display maps the fully assembled human brain alongside its clinical manifestations. The immense capability of this dense hierarchical architecture is tied directly to its predictable vulnerabilities. Every function operates on a localized bottom-up scale. The primal respiratory drive of the medulla sits firmly below the autonomic routing of the diencephalon, which supports the complex executive processing of the prefrontal cortex. The daily practice of neurology relies on this physical map. By testing physiological responses, a clinician deduces exactly which layer of the hierarchy has failed. A neurological lesion is a highly specific structural signature. By reading the deficits, we reveal the precise, localized organization of the central nervous system.